everybody for registering for this event, for their interest. We've had about 100 people, which shows the importance of the topic. And I really want to thank our panelists who've agreed quite quickly to participate. I particularly want to thank the senator as she is pushing for a bill, and was her idea actually to do this. So thank you. We're really grateful that you've made the time to talk here. This won't be the last of this kind of events. It fits with Sean's work, as he will indicate later, on local climate action and climate justice, community wealth building, which will require some rethinking of the procurement practices. Relates as well to our social inclusion work. It's important that procurement takes account of the environmental impact as well as social value, that it's not rooted explicitly in value for money, which is quite an abstract term. And I'm looking forward to the discussion later on this. So if you want to keep in touch with us and learn about future events, please subscribe to our newsletter. There will be several events coming up that I can announce now, and then I'll hand over to Sean. On April 16th, Rose Conway-Walsh, who is the Sinn Féin spokesperson on higher education, will join us for our conversations with decision makers. She'll be followed by the leader of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou McDonald, on April 26th. And then on May 25th, it'll be Alan Kelly, the leader of the Labour Party. Please join us for those. And if you want further details, feel free to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Shana, and thank you all for joining us this morning. We're here to talk about how progressive procurement can be at the core of building a fairer and greener economy. And looking at how a wider use and a stronger weighting for quality criteria could raise standards in areas like environment, employment, and deliver the greatest public benefit. So without further ado, I'll introduce Senator Alice Mary Higgins, who has tabled a private member's bill titled Quality in Public Procurement that aims to promote the use of social considerations and price quality ratios as award criteria in public contracts. This isn't the Senator's first foray into this work. She's been working on it for quite some time. Senator Higgins, I'll pass over to you and ask you to tell us a little bit about it.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to TASC for holding this event. And I know that you're going to be looking at this issue from a lot of different angles over the next months. So for me, my interest in the area of public procurement, it actually started previous to me becoming a senator when I was working with the National Women's Council of Ireland, and I was their policy officer with a particular focus on economic policy. And what I found was procurement issues were having a real effect in very different ways on all kinds of organizations. I mean, ranging from organizations who were dealing with areas like domestic violence supports to carers, where, for example, a procurement decision in relation to adult diapers had a huge, profound impact on the daily lives of carers. It changed their everyday. To community level organizations, to organizations working in the level of employment. It was coming through in lots of different ways, different difficulties, and quite often organizations were being told, you know, EU procurement rules are very strict. We don't have a lot of leeway. We can't take on board these different social or environmental concerns. And we're very limited in what we could do. So I actually then, Hugh Fraser, formerly of Combat Poverty, was the first person who mentioned, well, actually, there is more flexibility in the EU laws. And that's when I started to examine them around 2014. And in fact, the 2014 directives that were coming in from Europe and from the EU gave an awful lot of scope to considering social and environmental concerns, health concern, to give options and choice in terms of how public spending was good. And it was maybe a moment when they realized public spending can be a really powerful tool, you know, in terms of positive outcome. And they just had to manage that fact of the competitiveness across the EU within it. So I engaged at the time with the then public procurement officials to really push for ambitious transposition. Now, Ireland took some of the space that was within that transposition of the EU Directive 2014, but some of the options we didn't take. So, for example, we had the opportunity, which I'll come to in a moment, to exclude a lowest price only approach. But instead, the decision was to leave all of those different choices that I'll come to open and leave them to each public authority to decide for themselves. 7 years on, we've seen a lot of the impact of when you make awards of contracts for just based on lowest price only. And we've also seen the impact of inadequate use of quality on big projects. And rather than respond to each new controversy, I really wanted us to look at how we can prevent these controversies. But I also wanted to look in this legislation, not just at how we could avoid problems, but how we can actually have a really positive effect in terms of how we're using. So it's a very practical bill. It looks at 4 particular ways of shifting the culture and the practice in relation to public procurement. Firstly, is in relation to one of the earliest decisions made in relation to any public contract. And again, maybe just for context, we spend 12 billion each year in public contracts for goods, works, for services. So it's a huge expenditure. It's a huge leverage point. And one of the first important decisions for any contracting authority is, are they going to award this contract based on either lowest price only, where the lowest price will get the contract, what they call best price quality ratio, where you're looking at the balance of price and quality in terms of getting the best outcome, and our life cycle costing, which can be combined with price quality ratio in terms of where you look at the input of materials, you look at the disposable costs down the line, and you look at that kind of lifetime approach. So those are the 3 options available. And one problem we've seen is that too often lowest price or lowest price only can seem like the easier option to go for. And it is used to a large degree. And when it is used, we do see problems down the line. The cervical check is one issue where we saw a lowest price only, and the Scally report specifically highlighted the lack of quality criteria in that procurement as one of the problems that led to some very devastating outcomes. What my bill does is shift that so that lowest price only becomes the exception rather than any kind of a rule. Effectively, it respects the discretion, which was that government decision, in the initial point 2014, that they wanted to leave all 3 options open to contracting authorities. But it says that price quality ratio, either on its own or combined with life cycle costing, should be the default. It should be the standard. That's what you should be expected to go for when you are designing or putting out a call for tenders. And then you can, and a contracting authority under my legislation, they can still go with lowest price only, again, respecting that decision on discretion. However, they need to accompany it with an explanation or a declaration explaining why from the senior level official in that public body or department. So what that does is, it means in a simple way, and I always think, you either need to put thought into quality, or you need to put thought into why you're not thinking about quality. And effectively, it means that when decisions and if decisions are made to go with contracts on a lowest price only basis, that we have an accountability there. We know when that decision has been made, we know why it was made, and we know who made that decision. And I think that's really important in terms of creating, if anything, to create almost a level whereby it doesn't seem like the easy option anymore to go at lowest price only. It really encourages people to say it's actually worth putting the thought in and getting the better outcomes. I mean, again, I could have listed more examples. The Carillion contracts was another example, which had really devastating impacts in terms of a price only award in terms of schools and colleges, but I'm not going to go into them because what I really do want us to have is that positive discussion on how we can shift the system. In terms of the next part of the piece, and I can go in later, but I know Deirdre has more expertise on the kinds of things you can put into quality, because once you're talking about quality, of course, there's lots of different ways to measure it. It has to be measurable. It can't be kind of abstract. It has to be concrete, measurable ways. And there's lots of things there in terms of environmental standards, in terms of track record of delivery, which is really important, in terms of performance, in terms of quality of employment. There's space when you have quality there on the weighing scales on a project to really look to getting more from the public spending. And that's like maybe the positive and exciting piece about it, is what can be done there. And my bill doesn't prescribe or limit what might be done in that, but we give directions to some of the examples from Europe. The second part of the bill is relating to the really, really big projects. So it's one thing to say we need to think about price and quality, but when it comes to what I call once in a generation projects or once in a lifetime national infrastructure, we can't afford to get it wrong. And that's why the bill sets a target of a minimum 50% quality rating. And I mean, ideally more, of course, but a minimum 50% quality weighting for contracts over the EU public works threshold of 5.35 million. That's really important at the moment because we have 116 billion planned in new capital expenditure under the National Development Plan. So that was, you know, it's being debated right now. I'm sure many of you will have submitted or engaged with the review of the National Development Plan. We're talking about 116 billion in large contracts. And it's absolutely crucial that we don't get that wrong, because we know what happens when it does. And again, another example, unfortunately, is the National Children's Hospital, which had a 75% weighting for price and only a 25% rating for quality, which meant that a bid, even though it was 130 million under any other bid, effectively automatically got that contract, and leading to problems down the road. And that's a general problem we've seen, is that issue where you get lowball bids who win contracts, and then the negotiations start after that in terms of supplementary claims. I think there's been 300 million in contractor claims on the National Children's Hospital. But again, that practice whereby you know what you need to do to get your foot in the door. And then once you've had the contract, then you start talking about additional costs and additional add-ons. So this bill would give that space to tackle that. And it would mean, because of course, you know, the Carillion, again, to bring that example, they had a very high risk rating, but effectively the contracting authority were not empowered to think about that risk rating when they were making the award of the contract. And again, I would say I'm talking about the risks, but I do want to emphasize this is a chance to deal with the positives as well. And it's a chance to look to what can be achieved and to reward companies, including SMEs, who are raising standards, are leading the way in terms of environmental standards, employment standards, innovation, new design. It's a matter of actually, you know, raising the bar and rewarding companies that raise the bar and have that track record of good service. Now, I know I'm short of time, so the next two I'll be very quick on. The next two aspects of the bill, one is to ask that we would have ministerial guidelines, which give examples and indeed support around for contracting authorities to encourage joined up thinking around the other social, environmental and sustainable established commitments that the state has. So, for example, the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disability is really important. This would be guidelines that would support you, even if you're doing something that might not seem directly related to disability, to say, how do I reflect this in the procurement process? And it would give a little bit of substance and detail. And there's really good examples of how that's been done in other countries. And it's important to remember, this is very much in spirit with the directive, because the directive, in fact, that kind of more ambitious 2014, came from Europe 2020 and that idea of, you know, smart, sustainable, inclusive growth. And it's specifically at the time, the Europe 2020, public procurement was identified as a key market-based instrument by the EU to achieve objectives for employment, climate change, energy sustainability, research development, education, and poverty reduction. So this is very much in spirit with that EU directive, if we try to look at a joined up approach, getting more from procurement. And then the very final point is that public duty on equality and human rights. So Ireland has its obligations under both the ECHR in terms of that act from 2003, but also that public duty on equality and human rights. It does apply to procurement. It's very clear that it applies to procurement, but that is not understood equally across all public bodies and departments. So what this bill would do would say, when you do your annual report on procurement, which you're going to be doing anyway, we want you to include reporting on how you have reflected the public duty and equality and human rights and how you've thought about it in the way you've designed and awarded contracts. And that's what the bill does effectively. So it is around a cultural shift. I believe it is a positive contribution to what has to be a wider piece around reforming and doing more with procurement. I know there's really interesting other things around community level procurement, times when maybe we shouldn't use competitive tenders, but should be using a grant-based, more empowering approach, ideas around green procurement and more we could do that. So I know that this is one piece in a wider conversation, but I do hope that it is a positive contribution. And I think it could send a really strong signal, if it is supported on Friday by all of the parties, to say the state values quality and the state will reward you and recognize you when you value quality. So thank you very much. And I'll pass over to the other experts in the room. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. And I think when you speak about a signal that can be offered in terms of driving cultural change, I think that's really important too in terms of our perspective on it. And like you say, we're looking to have a number of conversations around this area, particularly related to how our transformation in terms of the climate agenda and the environmental agenda can drive local development, and how we think about procurement has to be central to that. So thank you for starting this conversation today, and thank you for bringing the bill forward. We'll pass over next to Deirdre Hallinan. Deirdre is a lecturer at Dublin City University, and her research interests include EU public procurement regulation and finding ways for member states to implement social procurement. Her report last year, Social Clauses in Public Procurement, which was done with the Community Action Network, is a very impressive piece of work, and I'd encourage everyone on the call to take a look at it. So Deirdre, over to you.
Well, thanks, Sean. So I'm going to be speaking partly to the Senator's very welcome bill, and I'm going to try and explain how this bill is very timely at in this particular point in history, and our look at how public procurement and sustainability can be used as a really positive tool. So, you know, the aim of the bill, the Senator has gone through the four pillars of her bill. But what I thought I would look at is, when you are talking about public procurement, you will come across a number of obstacles that people feel are in their way as to why they wouldn't consider using sustainable either clauses or quality criteria. And one thing is that, you know, the EU, as Alice Mary said. And so I thought I would just say, you know, what is the situation with the EU? Like, why do they have anything to say about this at all? And why do people have this notion? Because once upon a time it was true. And why has this changed? So let me see. So yeah, a little bit of EU law here. And so, you know, as we know, when the EU was established, it was to create an integrated internal market. And to do this, the legal regime had to be built about allowing for the four freedoms, the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. And then a number of principles were directly emancipated from those four freedoms, which were equal treatment, non-discrimination, mutual recognition, proportionality, and transparency. And these are, you know, EU law. This has direct effect on public procurement. And so this is how we have to run our public procurement when we are buying goods for the state. We have to take all of this into consideration. And once upon a time, you know, they just decided the treaty would do the job of that. So there were no directives, and they just thought the treaty is going to be in control of that situation. And, you know, but so basically what happened? Member states just ignored it. And, you know, so it was like a lot of bad practices ensued. And the Commission was very concerned about this. There was an awful lot of evidence of the evils of protectionism. And it was seen as if this protectionism was like, you know, extremely negative in terms of the aim of having an internal market. And so what they decided to do was introduce directives in order to really stop the main problem they had was protectionism. There was other issues too. There was also got to do with product and technical standards. And so directives were brought in it started in the 70s, and they've been many reiterations since. And initially those directives were presenting this economic rationale view of the directives. And so once upon a time, it would be very, very difficult to have any other policy considerations in your purchases that were not just concerned with the main purchase because of the directives. But then member states rebelled against this. This was seen as being way too restrictive on purchases. It was understood that what the directives should have been about was how we buy, not what we buy. And so case law developed, and eventually, the perception of the EU itself changed. So the EU decided themselves that they had shifted, and their shift from being this just purely economic, internal market focused purpose shifted to this idea of being a social market economy, where there was this allowance that they were responsible for encouraging good environmental practices and good social practices. And so you can see here that the 2014 directives embody that shift, and they embody these allowances now that member states are allowed to have a number of different types of, and it's not, it's environmental, it's social, it's also focused on innovative freedoms given to member states and contracting authorities. So, what do the directives do? So the directives, all they're doing is applying the principles of non-discrimination, equal treatment, and transparency. That's all they're doing. And they're doing it, this is how they do it. So what must we do? We have to publish things in the OJ. We have to design technical specifications so that they are all 27 member states have basically the same type of specifications. They dictate how we conduct. They control the process of how we select candidates and tenderers. And then finally, they tell us about the awarding of contracts. And so here we're getting into the bill, because the idea was in the 2014 directive, I'll go back to that. The 2014 directive, they allow us now to award on the basis of most economical advantageous tender, which actually they did in the 2004 directive as well. So we have this option of assessing for best price quality ratio or price or cost alone. And we had a choice when we were implementing the directive, when we were transposing it, we had the choice of just saying just best price quality ratio. And Ireland chose not to do that. Whenever we're transposing directives, Ireland tends to take a sort of just a cut and paste approach. So the option is still there for us. And so Alice Mary's bill is just making it difficult to do this, which is what they wanted. This is what the EU want anyway. And why would you want to do this? Well, if you look from the EU perspective, the EU is promoting public procurement as a policy instrument. I mean, that is the recital 94 for the main directive, is giving the purpose of what these directives are. It's protection of the environment, promotion of sustainable development, while ensuring that they can obtain best value for money for their contracts. So it's not EU law, isn't the problem. So what's the problem? So the problem is that it's really got to do with lack of political will, and that report after report indicates this. And so so how can you how can you create political will? And one really good way is to embed it in legislation, so that the legislation itself has a knock-on effect, so that it gives freedom to contracting authorities, whether they be big or small, to make changes because they have support now. So that's the research report I did with CAN for IREC. This is one that was done by SMART that was published very recently as well. And so some of these are some of the findings. And, you know, it is a case of that 55% of EU procurement procedures in the whole of Europe. It's not like Ireland, or we are, you know, that is, this isn't a criticism of Ireland. There are many member states that have far worse practices than we do. And in fact, you know, there are many people who are engaging in fantastic practices in Ireland. The idea is that how do you just make it be more across the board, and how do you you know, provide a support for everyone to do it? So it's not just the ones who already have been exposed to it or interested specifically in it. And so, you know, there is this idea that it's more expensive, and reports have shown in this particular report that was done by Professor Robert Canato for SMART, they show that, you know, on average, sustainable produced products can be cheaper or as competitive as conventional ones. So, you know, as Alice Mary said, you know, the bill is based on the Dutch approach. The Dutch, they also did not outlaw low price only from the directive, but because they're a civil law country, what they do is they bring in extremely detailed legislation, and their detailed legislation dictates that it's very similar to the bill. It is a case of that they're encouraging best price quality ratio. They have a very high standard of what that is, and they make it very difficult, but not impossible, to do price only. So it's the case of course, there's always going to be procurement that practically, it's just, that's the practical way to do it. If it's something that already has an awful lot of, it's very technical or very specific, then there's no need to do it. So what are the criteria? So, you know, that is the list from the directive. And what they say themselves in the directive is that this is only illustrative. So the idea is that, again, you have to be mindful of the fact that quality isn't the English word definition of quality. It's a lot broader than that. So, you know, quality can include experience of staff, which is a new inclusion. It can include, you know, how fast the delivery of it is that you want it to be. It can be designed for all users. So it's very broad, and also there is this flexibility there that you can have conversations pre-procurement as to what it is that you want your quality to be. And so there is, you know, so what they do in the Dutch approach is they have a conversation, is what is their minimum quality criteria, and they put that into their technical specifications. They include that as a technical specification, and then they say, but what would be great? What would be more than that? And that's what they put in then into their award criteria. Like, what would be the extra that they would like? And so the experience in the Netherlands has been that you know, that they have found that this hasn't been a more expensive approach. They have found that it has, you know, they've had very positive results from, they've produced 2 reports since they've introduced this, and it's all been very positive. And, you know, so, and the main thing is it's avoiding awarding low cost tendering, which can meet the technical specification but scores low on quality. And, you know, this idea of having it over 50%, the reason for that is that if you don't have it over 50%, the arguments that studies have shown is that then you're really just having it as price only. You may as well only have it as price only, because the price will dominate so much. So that's the reason why you're asking it to be 50. And even though that sounds high, it's not high when you think about it in terms of like, oh, I can put in that I want the delivery to be this particular, you know, when you're talking about, it's not quality, it's got to do with a very wide interpretation of the word quality. So, you know, there are many situations that it's not appropriate, and that's a given. The guidelines are a huge important part of this, because, you know, in countries where sustainable procurement is done on a regular basis, the governments support it. And so even though we can look and, the Office of Government Procurement produced an information note recently, and it was great. So that's like step one. But in Scotland, in the Netherlands, and Northern Ireland, they have like this a suite of, it's like first class travel. They have websites in which you, as either a procurer or a bidder, can go online, and they bring you through a step-by-step approach, exactly, how to do these things, because it is time consuming. It is particular. It does require training. And the days of sort of saying that this approach is, oh, it's easy, or it's not. But at the same time, it is just a case of that the work that you put in pre-procurement, it's that whole thing, you prepare to fail, fail to prepare. It's that whole thing. You put the work in there, and you acknowledge that, yes, there is a cost to this. There is a cost to preparing well, but the cost is really just about the quality of the product that you will ultimately be purchasing and delivering, and that it's not a game of bidding so that then you get the bid and then all the bets are off, and then once the contract is ongoing, that's when all the negotiation really starts. That shouldn't be what's happening. That should be done, at the beginning, before, just when you're thinking about it. And then the final part of this has to do with the Echr Act. And I was very interested when I was doing the research for Echr Act on social clauses, to realize that the public sector duty is directly connected to public procurement. So there already is a public sector duty on public bodies. The problem is that a lot of public sector bodies may not really be aware of it, or they may not have the ability to put it into their procurements, or they may not have training. Again, by putting it into another bill, you're providing another way of legitimatizing the duty that they're already under. So I think this is a really good part of the bill. Again, the UK do this, and they, as a result of having it as linked to procurement directly, it means that public bodies then have to have a report every year as to what did they do or not do in connection to their public duty. And it can give a space where they're allowed to actually spend time thinking about it. So I think I've lost my mouse. Sorry, here it is. So finally, yeah, so I do think that this bill is really timely for, providing political will to public bodies to be able to engage in sustainable procurement. So that's it. Thanks very much. I will stop sharing my screen for now. Let me see. Stop share.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. That was remarkably informative. There's already a question in the chat about whether the presentation might be made available after, and we could certainly talk about that. But thank you. I'm keen to move on just to make sure that we've time for questions at the end. We've 60 people in attendance, which is fantastic still. So I'd like to introduce Kevin Callanan now, who is General Secretary of Forza and President of ICTU, or Vice President of ICTU and Chair of the Congress's Public Services Committee. He's also a member of the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council and the National Economic and Social Council. And Kevin, we just invite you to offer some reflections from your own perspective on the opportunities presented by a more progressive procurement regime.
Thanks, Sean, and good morning, everyone. First of all, I think this is a very welcome initiative, a very welcome bill, and a very welcome debate. And as both of the speakers, Senator Higgins and Dr. Halloran, have said, it's connected to a number of other things, but I think this forms part of what should be our joint responsibility, I think, to ensure that we come out of the pandemic with better solutions than we came out of the financial crisis with. And I suppose whether public services are provided directly by the state or through public procurement, we need to extend the awareness of the concept of the public good and why it exists. And if we reflect for a minute on public services and what their purpose is, I think that they really serve to civilize society and to care for, to comfort, to heal, to nurture, to inspire, to educate our citizens. That's why FORSA and indeed our international federations, the European Federation of Public Service Unions and Public Service International, the Global Federation, put such an emphasis on quality public services and the need for workers within public services to campaign for quality within those public services. And as has been said, the interplay between quality and cost or value for money is absolutely central to the discussion that we're having. As has been acknowledged by Senator Higgins, the state, given the spend on public procurement, has a huge influence as a purchaser and as a consumer. And clearly, the ability of social and environmental clauses to influence how we would achieve policy goals, whether it's in relation to climate action or in relation to workers' rights, should be obvious and apparent. That's why within the trade union movement in the public sector, we have for many, many years now, even going back to prior to the financial crisis, had to battle to ensure that we had safeguards within those agreements in relation to what the other side would probably describe as service delivery options we might characterize as outsourcing. And it's been important for us to ensure that unit labor costs don't represent the criterion for the awarding of contracts. But despite our success in relation to that, I think it belies a mindset on the government side, the very fact that we have to do it in the first place. And I think we have learned, certainly in the recent agreement negotiated in December, the current agreement building momentum, it is the intention of the trade unions to be much more active on policing the commitments that are within the agreement. So obviously all of this sits within a European context. I think the EU semester program, which gives effect to the EU fiscal rules introduced in the wake of the financial crisis, has been something that we've been very concerned about, particularly in Ireland, and particularly about the absence of significant consultation and social dialogue on its terms. Interestingly, the 2020 country-specific recommendations for Ireland showed a marked change in that they emphasized the importance of resilience, particular emphasis on public services, among other things contained within those recommendations. But the response to the Recovery and Resilience Plan suddenly had to include not just the 2020 country-specific recommendations, but also the 2019 ones. And I think, just coming to conclude, I think what that tells us is that we need to start asking some fundamental questions. We need to start asking, why is it that we operate a health system here where 50% of the population rely on private health insurance, with all the inequities and kinks that brings to the system? Why is it that, when the pandemic struck, in terms of elder care, so much of this was marketized? How is it that while we all generally accept that children from 5 to 18 should have the ability to access a public education system, why is it that in their most formative years, from 0 to 5, that we think it's okay for most of them to be exposed to a market system? Or why is it that when the state began to run down the housing program in the wake of the recession in 1987 and started withdrawing from building of public housing, started running down employment in that area, where we now have a real deficit in terms of apprenticeships and skilled craft workers in that area? We're bearing the fruits of that in the current housing crisis. So we need to start thinking about all of these things it seems to me that this is an important debate in forming a coalition of various interests, including trade unions, to actually promote a progressive approach to this and to ensure that the voice is heard. So I very much welcome Senator Higgins' initiative. I very much welcome the bill, and I think this is a really important debate that we have to ensure happens and that we maximize support for this approach.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you for those provocations at the end. I think those fundamental questions you're pointing to really highlight how the issue of procurement interlinks with issues of inequality, issues of functioning democracy. So thank you. We have about 10, we might go 15 minutes. There's a lot of questions coming in, so apologies, we won't get to all of them. I can say that now. But I'll try to touch on some because they're very thought-provoking and there's a lot of expertise clearly in amongst our attendees as well. I'll just note that Paula Dwyer says that the fact that EU doesn't limit procurement spending or procurement processes should be shouted from the rooftops. And I think that's something that probably Senator Higgins and Dr. Halloran and Kevin would all agree with. Orla Barry just quickly asks a little bit about the anticipated timescale for the passing of the bill. Senator Higgins, would you like to speak to that? Sorry, you're on mute, Senator.
Apologies. Literally just while I was listening to Kevin's really interesting response, at the same time, I actually was just getting a text in. As I say, I've had really very strong, long engagement on this. So I'm impatient, I would put it this way, because this is an issue I worked on since I came in 2016. I had previous legislation on this, which passed second stage. I took on board government feedback and in fact came back with this revised and I think incredibly tightly worded bill. I've just got a signal today now that the government have put in a motion to ask that, so they will be, I will of course want the bill to be passing second stage today and Friday, moving to committee stage as soon as possible. It looks like there's going to be a government motion that it would be read in 12 months, which as I understand it will mean that it will be deemed to have passed second stage and that it's not been opposed, but the debate on committee stage will not be able to occur until 12 months after the second stage debate. So in a way, you know, it's positive that it's not a direct opposition, but I would have liked to see the government allowing this to pass second stage and get that momentum for committee stage. So that's kind of, I've literally, you know, I have to consider, of course, my response and engagement with that motion, but that is, as I understand, what the government will do. That said, I do think that politically, a lot of politicians across all parties see the impacts of procurement and policy. They feel very strongly about particular examples of that. So I do think there is some cross-party political interest. So I'll of course be wanting it to pass second stage fully on Friday, but it may be that a motion from the government will mean it is only deemed to have passed second stage in 12 months' time. And in the meantime, I think it will be very crucial if we see government legislation on this, because, you know, the National Development Plan, that 116 billion in contracts, I imagine that the tenders for those are about to start going out very, very soon. So if, you know, if we look to that, I think it's really important that we don't lose, you know, the next 3 years in trying to design a better procurement process and do 100 billion in procurement in the meantime. So that's kind of where we're at. I literally, sorry for I've just got it in this minute in terms of what the government response will be.
Thank you for that, Senator. We have another, I'll just keep spinning through these questions because there are a lot. We have another from Barry Murphy, who asks, what are the panelists' views on the lack of policing on procurement contracts, which lead to substandard work? And also suggests that a mandatory percentage of the workforce should be apprenticeships, internships on procurement contracts. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Well, the whole project I worked on previously with CAN was this idea, was exactly that of the, you know, these are called social clauses, and you certainly can do it. and the government has actually done a pilot study on it, and they got the NTMA to have apprentices on the work that they were doing, and they had very high success in carrying out the work. And so you realize that when the government tells a body to do it, the body does it. Like people who are involved in procurement in the process, they have no issue whatsoever. Just like back in the day when health and safety legislation was brought in, people just get on with it and do it, and that's what was found. Even though the Children's Hospital has had issues, the Children's Hospital does have social clauses, and they did, and that was, the CAN and the Rialto Rights Group worked very, very hard to get what they could do into that. So, and they have been very successful. And I noticed another comment there was talking about the reserve contract, and that is a fantastic initiative under the directive. And actually, in the Children's Hospital, Ingrid, the community benefit manager, was the first person in Ireland to ever have a reserved contract. And it is really good example of how it can be done. So yes, all of this can be done. This is just, this bill is just, this bill is asking for about award criteria, but there's a lot more that can be done in this field.
Just on the qualifications issue, those are directly named, like qualifications and training are named as criteria in terms of the EU that can be there. And one thing I think is really important, we know there's this process whereby you get ringers, whereby, a big company will have somebody with level 5 experience who goes in, does the pitch, gets the contract, and then they can give it to anyone, in terms of they pass it on. So one thing it would deal with is that idea of it is reasonable as a contractor to expect that you would have people of a level of experience with a level of continuity, the level of training, actually doing the work. And that's what quality criteria can do for that. And it deals with the fact of the actual qualifications of those delivering the work, not just the company. And I noticed that Michael Taft had a question, which I think related to the question of, can you have a social clause, in relation to cooperation with the state's industrial machinery? I don't know if you would need it as a social clause, but I think you could make it as a quality criteria that you could, and this is the thing, it's a lot easier to reward good practice than punish bad practice, whereby you reward companies that can show that they have a record of cooperation with the state's industrial machinery, which means that as a contracting authority, you can be confident that there's not going to be unforeseen delays or, bad practice or breaks or strikes. And so, it gives you the confidence that this is a quality company in terms of employment and that they are using mechanisms appropriately to ensure consistent delivery. So again, we almost go a stage above social clauses and we deal with it at the quality criteria right at the point when we're deciding who gets the contract.
Thank you, Senator. Deputy Mairead Farrell asks, what additional data do you think the OGP should be collecting in order to give us a better overview of the state of play in public procurement? My one thought on that, from my own looking at the community wealth building side of things, it would be lovely if we had a database of just that gave us a sense of the amounts that were spent under certain thresholds, so we understood what was going on and knew how that could be better tailored towards things like community wealth building. But maybe over to you guys.
Just to say, the OGP were recently in front of the PAC committee, and I think it was quite disappointing for members of the PAC committee, in fact, that the OGP kind of very much was saying, we give our input in terms of information and suggestions and what you can do, but we don't actually track enough what projects go over, what projects go over spend, go over time. And I think that's one of the gaps, and this bill does have greater reporting, and even the very fact that we document those decisions that are being made would make a difference, I think, in terms of when lowest price, for example, is used, whether the public duty and equality we're doing. So I think tracking how the decisions were made is important. We definitely need better data in tracking the outcomes. And just a last example of that, in the Netherlands, which again, that Dutch model is the key in this, it really helped inspire this legislation. That tracking really shows the difference. So 73% of contracts under best price quality ratio in the Netherlands still went to the lowest bid. The lowest bid still got them, but only when that lowest bid had proven themselves on quality. And, Deirdre mentioned, we know that there was a 3% additional cost in the procurement process because they'd bring in quality, but there was a 2.4 times additional benefit. And I think if we tracked the outcomes from procurement, we would continue to strengthen the case for quality procurement because we would be tracking that the outcomes are better. And that's what they've seen elsewhere.
Yes, I would agree with that, because I think what we need to do is systematize this so that actually there's as an equal pressure on the awarders of the contracts to observe quality. And we're not great. We tend to deal with these things on a case-by-case basis rather than to try and ensure that that informs the approach. And certainly this is a big challenge. The scale of this is enormous, and for an individual trade union or even a federation to be able to monitor this is virtually impossible. So we need to ensure that our demands create the mechanisms that we can rely on to deliver those outcomes.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm conscious of time, and so we're close to wrapping up, and the questions are still coming in. So obviously it highlights the desire to have these conversations. One thing just to conclude, there's a question from Barry Thomas about asking whether the panelists could comment on what potential there is for these changes to support a community wealth building model in Ireland. What I'd say to Barry on that point, and maybe the panelists will be interested too, this we hope will be the first in a series of events on spending better, looking at how a variety of different modalities of spending can help accelerate improved social, environmental and economic outcomes in Ireland. Specifically, we're going to look to host an event in about 4 weeks' time on community wealth building, with a view of how the community-led local development multi-fund approach that we currently don't opt into from the EU could really catalyze bottom-up community-led approaches. Obviously, progressive procurement is central to successfully implementing a community wealth building model, and this bill, along with a shift in culture, would be essential to see community wealth building properly embraced in this country. But I might also, if anyone else has anything to add, we would be very interested.
I don't want to jump in, but I mean, I think there's lots of more that can be done in terms of procurement. The sheltered, I know that there was comments from around the use of, the sheltered projects, the reserved contracts. There's areas of social and indeed health services that don't need to be part of competitive tender, which can be excluded from some of this kind of process. There's also a really important role for grants, because grants allow, in fact, invest in communities and allow them to develop solutions. So just to say, this isn't the only piece, but within this piece, where there are competitive tenders, I do think this would contribute to community, because once you start talking about quality, once you have to populate that side of the weighing scales that's about quality, then it becomes a matter of, you cannot say it's simply scale. So it discourages, for example, maybe some of the bundling we've seen, a very infamous example being where all of the library books in Ireland were all put as one big bundled contract with no, for example, if you'd had quality criteria there, you might be looking at what are the additional benefits. Will people in a community be able to buy books themselves, inspired, that follow up, so you could have looked to some of the additional measures there. And what it also does when you have quality is it supports innovation. As Deirdre said, it's not just, as I say, about avoiding the mistakes. And I know I emphasize that. It is around, for example, if you are a contracting authority and you see a community that have a new idea that is better, that achieves what you want to achieve with your contract better than you imagined in the technical specifications, but they're offering something really good in terms of the environment, they've identified a way to do it better, then you can reward that. So it encourages that kind of innovation and creativity which is at the core, I think, of some of the really brilliant projects in community wealth building we're seeing, around the country. And again, it also encourages, so that you can better measure quality, that you might not always go to projects at the same huge scale, but that you are saying, let's measure it in terms of region, or let's measure it even maybe at a more local level. It also really empowers, I think, local authorities in terms of their funding. So I think it can be really complementary. And again, it encourages an ecosystem which raises the bar, because if companies need to raise the bar in order to win big government contracts, then they think about their supply chain, and the community wealth building input often comes in that supply chain. We all know, it's not just about a single product. It's about that single product uses salt from Achill, or has taken the trouble to look at how honey is produced, or is trying to have an ethical supply chain down the line. So for some of those community projects, it might be about them getting into a supply chain, and then the company further up that supply chain being in a better position to win government contracts because they have that quality.
Thank you, Senator. We're right on time. I think we might conclude there, unless Kevin or Deirdre, would you have anything you'd like to add? No.
Well, just to say, it's great to see people interested in this, and it's great to see people engaged, because, and there is a lot of questions, and just to say that, all of us can push for this, and that I really think that there is this possibility of having that Ireland really could change its approach, and that we're not doing that badly. That's the thing. When you're working with public officials, an awful lot of people on an individual basis really would be interested in doing this.
And judging by the feedback from people in attendance here today, yeah, no, I think that is the feeling that's held generally. So that's great. Thank you, Dr. Hallinan. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Senator Alice Mary Higgins. We will wrap it up there, just to say, keep an eye out. We'll be hosting more of these events in the weeks ahead. So thank you all, and thanks again to our panelists. Have a good day.
Bye now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.